we're spending $7 trillion a year this year. We'll take in 5. So we're spending 40% more money, and we've accumulated a debt that's 6 times the amount of money that we're taking in. I think of myself being very much like a doctor. I watch the plaque build up in the system.
So what Ray is doing there is lumping together government debt and private debt. Ray is halfway there, but not the full way there. But he's making the same mistake the mainstream does. On my last comment on Ray Dalio, I pointed out the reason that he is right about how the economy operates and the mainstream is wrong. The reason being that he understands credit. So this is part of Ray Dalio's 44 million view video, how the economic machine works. And let's just watch this bit about where he explains why credit matters and why that gives him a very different economics.
Why is credit so important? When someone's income rises, it makes lenders more willing to lend him money because now he's more worthy of credit. A credit-worthy borrower has 2 things, the ability to repay and collateral. And since one person's spending is another person's income, this leads to more increased borrowing and so on. This self-reinforcing pattern leads to economic growth and is why we have cycles.
Well, there's 2 reasons why Dalio is way ahead of mainstream economics on that front. Firstly, he asserts quite correctly that credit adds to total spending. And secondly, this generates cycles. That's where the neoclassical majority who dominate the economics profession today, they argue that credit does not add to aggregate demand, and they try to argue that capitalism is a system that tends towards equilibrium. So let's see what they think happens when banks do lending. This is putting the textbook vision of what banks actually do into my Ravel software. And what the textbook tells you is that banks don't actually lend money. What they tell you instead is banks are what they call intermediaries, and they enable savers to lend to borrowers. And in most of the textbooks, pretty much all of them actually, they'll say the households are the ones who save and the firms and the governments are the ones who borrow off households. So I'll put this together in one of my Ravel models, and what it says is that effectively households and firms and the government all bank at the private banks, and then all the payments of wages by firms and consumption by workers and borrowing by firms and interest payments by households, all this stuff happens through bank accounts. And you have a rising level of private debt, but nothing happens to GDP. That's the big difference with Dalio's argument. He says rising levels of private debt cause rising levels of GDP. Let's just simulate this model here. You can see that GDP immediately flatlines. You also can see that the ratio of debt of the borrowers in the private sector, when this model adjusts the firms, rises linearly over time, but the government debt rises exponentially. So this is the model that the mainstream has, and they don't worry about a level of private debt. They argue that it doesn't matter how high it gets. Notice the debt level here for the private sector is already reaching about 300% of GDP. The main thing they worry about is the level of government debt and say this is going to cause a total catastrophe unless we cut the deficit and so on. And when you put Ray's vision into Ravel, what actually happens is you no longer treat the debt of firms as an asset of the household sector. You now treat it as an asset of the banking sector. And interest payments by the firms are made to the banks. So that's the change that Ray has made, and he's thinking about the role of credit in the economy. And let's see what happens in that situation. So I'm going to run it with exactly the same setting as beforehand for the level of private borrowing and government borrowing. And now you can see the big difference. This is what Dalio correctly points out. Rising levels of money enable rising levels of transactions. You get rising GDP from a rising level of private debt. Now, government debt is a different form of problem in this vision. You don't get the exponential increase in the government debt ratio now because borrowing by private firms is increasing the level of GDP. So what you now get is a linear relationship for rising levels of government debt, and the actual debt of firms actually stabilizes. In Ray's mind, we still have a problem with rising levels of government debt. Let's see him saying this just recently.
What is your take on President Trump pushing the Fed chair to lower interest rates in terms of the good of the health of the economy?
The political system wants the stimulation, provide credit, and with the providing of the credit, everybody's happy because things go up, but they go up as you accumulate a lot of debt. And now we're in a situation where the government has such a large amount of debt.
So there is Dalio agreeing with the majority that the level of government debt is a problem, and we now have to reduce interest rates or government spending to make that burden lower.
Let's look at that. What we have is we're spending $7 trillion a year that we'll take in 5. So we're spending 40% more money than we're taking in. And we've accumulated a debt that's 6 times the amount of money that we're taking in. As a result of that, interest payments and debt service payments are adding up. And so you're seeing that debt service, interest, crowding out spending.
He's not as extreme as Elon Musk trying to completely eliminate the deficit, but he's saying we've got to reduce it. What Ray has done, which is different to the mainstream, is he said it's not true. Firms borrow from households, firms borrow from banks. And by making that change and that change alone, he can see the role of credit in the economy, credit causing GDP to rise, which the mainstream simply doesn't understand. He's still got the government only doing stuff which affects the distribution of money in the economy. It doesn't create any money. Whereas what he's done with the firm sector, by say firms borrow from the banks, not from households, the borrowing operation, which was on the liability side of the banks model in the textbook argument, goes across to the asset side. And that means that the borrowing by the firm sector creates debt. He understands very well that money is created by debt. It creates debt there, but it also creates money over here. They sell bonds to households, they pay interest to households. All this stuff for the government in that mental model that Ray has is still on the liability side, and therefore it doesn't create money. So government debt can rise, but it doesn't create any money and doesn't offset the problem. In the real world, the government also, in the first instance, sells its bonds to the private banks. So what I've done with this model is I've taken the textbook model and I've simply said that the debt of the government is not an asset of the household sector, it's an asset of the banks. The government's paying interest to the banks rather than paying interest to the households. But fundamentally, this is the system in which we live. So spending by the government in excess of taxation, that creates money. Running the deficit actually creates money. The bond sales in this properly modified model are a transfer of the asset that backs money from reserves to bonds, and then the interest payments by the government actually increase the money supply. They're not taking money away from the private sector, which is what happens in both the textbook model and the slightly modified model that Ray has in his head, which is more accurate because it's correct about credit, but he's wrong about fiat. So what happens in this model when I've got the bare bones of the proper system that banks lend to firms and that banks are the first buyers of government bonds? Let's run this model and see what happens. And what you get is different to the model that Ray has in his head, where there's still a rising level of government debt to GDP if the government is spending more than it takes back in taxation. The system stabilises. We get a faster rate of growth because both borrowing by firms and fiat money creation by running a deficit by the government are creating money that's enabling more economic activity. The system grows more rapidly. This is the full model. So Ray's very correct, and this is a huge difference with the mainstream in understanding the role of credit. But he's making the same mistake the mainstream does of not seeing that fiat has a similar role. And fiat money is created by the government spending more than it gets back in taxation. So with that system, you grow more rapidly, and the debt ratios in both cases now stabilise relative to GDP. Now, of course, the real world is not this stable. This is a very simple model. I haven't got any income distribution dynamics. If I do include those, and this is a more general model, what I can do as model is look at the dynamic impact of changes in employment rate affecting the capacity of workers to get wage rises, which gives you one cycle, a cycle in addition to the credit cycle. Then I bring in the credit cycle and show the role of debt. And finally, I bring in the role of government. So I'm going to do this first of all just by simulating a model. And what you get out of that system are distribution cycles that are driven by changes in the distribution of income between workers and capitalists. You go to boom and a slump, there's no long-term trend. Now, Ray is quite right to say that when you bring in credit, you bring in private debt in that case, then you can get these cycles and they can lead to what he calls both the long-term debt cycle, but this also generates both long and short-term cycles. So just watch this one for a short while and you'll see that the cycle is no longer closed. You have a rising level of private debt to GDP. Income of workers goes down as debt goes up, even though in this model I don't have workers doing any borrowing at all. The system looks like it's stabilising, so the short-term cycles that Ray has as part of his analysis actually diminish over time, and a neoclassical economist looking at this might think, oh, we must be heading towards equilibrium then, which is what the mistake they made about the 1990s to 2007 period, when the cycles diminished in what they called the Great Moderation. They didn't realise that that was the precursor to a financial crisis. I did, because I built this model in 1992, and it had this striking outcome that you would have a period of diminishing cycles leading to rising cycles, and you can see that turning up in the simulation now, and ultimately you'd have a level of private debt that wiped the economy out. That's the deleveraging cycle that Ray also puts as part of his analysis. So that's private debt becomes overwhelming, the system breaks down. That's what happens without government spending. Now let's add government spending inside there and see what happens. And what happens with government spending is, and Ray talks about this a bit himself in his own coverage, government spending goes up during downturns because unemployment rises and profits fall, so the government spending increases and government tax revenue falls, so the government deficit actually increases at that side. So what do you get out of this system? Now this gets to be quite elaborate. You'll see in a moment. It looks like it's heading exactly the same way as the private sector, but then it changes direction, and then it changes direction again. So some of the long cycles that Ray is seeing in his three-factor system, the level of productivity, long-term debt cycle, and short-term debt cycle, rather than being additive, they're part of the same complex system. And this model generates all those results in one go. And you end up with a system which does not break down. Whereas with the private sector alone, you'd have a breakdown because government spending, which is independent of what the credit system does, enables it to pump money into the economy when the private sector is taking money out by credit turning negative. And that means you get these very complex interactions over time. You don't get a breakdown. This is now taking out the government role. I've still got the fiat being calculated, but it's not being spent into the economy. So this is what the red line is what the government would do if the government was running counter-cyclical policies. The black line is what the private sector does in the absence of those counter-cyclical policies. And what you'll see is you get to the stage where credit goes negative. It's starting to happen now at about the 60 or 70 year mark in the simulation. And if there were government spending in the opposite direction, that would counteract the downturn. And because the cycles are more extreme in the sector with only private spending, the scale of what the government would need to do gets bigger, as you can see from these cycles here. Whereas we turn the government sector on and see what happens to both credit and fiat, then ultimately you get the fiat money is turning up in the system as well, out of phase with the credit system. And that what it means is fiat spending compensates for negative periods of credit. Then when there's excessive credit, fiat goes in the opposite direction, and that's a stabilizing system. And unfortunately, this is the consequence if we do actually follow the advice of people who've got either a completely wrong model of how the financial sector operates, which is mainstream economics, or which is half right, which is Ray Dalio, but doesn't understand what the fiat system does. Take that away and you don't have the stability anymore. You're going to have a breakdown. Ray is halfway there, but not the full way there. And you can see that if you watch his explanation of debt when he's talking about the Great Depression and the global financial crisis.
Debt repayments continue to rise, which makes spending drop even further, and the cycle reverses itself. This is the long-term debt peak. Debt burdens have simply become too big. For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason it happened in Japan in 1989 and in the United States back in 1929.
So what Ray is doing there is lumping together government debt and private debt. And this is where he's leading himself astray, because if you take a look at the actual level of total debt, you can see that my chart there, it's an extended version of what Ray is showing here. A peak of debt in 2008, about 400% of GDP, peak in the 1920s, about 300% of GDP. So that's the total debt burden. My numbers are different because I've got a different source, the census data here. But what is actually happening with those two components of debt is that rising private debt enables a lower level of government debt, or a lower level of government debt encourages people to borrow money from the banking sector because there's not enough money being created by the government sector. So they tend to go in opposite directions. Then when you have a downturn, you see the downturn, this is a huge plunge in private debt at the aftermath of the 1920s and into the Great Depression. And government debt then rises to compensate for the impact of diminishing credit-based demand. So they operate in opposite directions. And there's one of the most important periods that this happened during was the 1920s, because you then had a president, Calvin Coolidge, who was obsessed about reducing the level of government debt, which is down here. As you can see, private debt was substantially higher. He managed to reduce the level of government debt from about 30% of GDP to 15%, and thought that's what caused the boom of the 1920s. In fact, what caused the boom was the data he wasn't looking at, which was the rising level of private debt, enabling a higher level of credit-based demand in the economy until the credit bubble burst in 1929. And then when it burst, the debt ratio actually rose, as Ray said it does during deflation. People are paying their debt down at this period, but the debt ratio is rising because deflation is increasing the outstanding value of private debt. Now, the government debt rises in the opposite direction. That provides a backstop to the collapse in credit. And you can see this when you take a look at the level of the annual change in private debt, which is credit, and the annual change in government debt, which is effectively fiat. You have this period during the 1920s, where because Coolidge is obsessed with reducing government debt, you get about a 1% of GDP surplus every year, and he thought that was causing the boom. In fact, at the same time, there's this substantial increase in credit through most of that time period. That's what gave us the boom. Then it crashed, and then the government spending comes back in. Then you have another crash, and look what actually ended the whole cycle, the enormous level of fiat money creation done to finance World War II. Now, from that point on, and this again is where Ray knows what he's talking about, credit has been much larger than fiat money spending. This is because you're stuffing with a system you don't understand. The attempts of neoliberal governments to reduce the level of government debt while ignoring private debt lead to more private borrowing, which leads to things like the subprime bubble. Then when that crashes, the government comes back in again, forced by the effectively automatic stabilisers. There's less tax revenue and more unemployment, so government spending rises even without deliberate government behaviour, but that then stabilises the system. We need to appreciate that that's the role of government spending, is to stabilise the unstable private sector economy and prevent the possibility of a debt deflation. And if we take away that government spending or try to reduce it, we're more likely to trigger it than stop it. This is where Ray has to expand his model. He has to go from the one he's got in his head at the moment, which is effectively this one, where he's with the borrowing by firms from the textbook side of the equation where banks are just intermediaries, to the real world where banks originate money and debt. So what Ray needs to do is to go that one step further and include the fact that as well as firms borrowing from the banking sector, it's the banking sector that buys the bonds that are first sold by the government to cover its deficit. And when that happens, you don't get that automatic breakdown that he's worried about. What you do get in the real world is the stabilising impact. So Ray, you do understand credit in the way the mainstream economists don't, but you've got to take your knowledge one step further. Look at how the government sector operates. So unfortunately, by joining the chorus of the mainstream about the dangers of government debt, where they've got the wrong model of government debt, and you currently share that model, you are taking away the stabiliser from this system that can lead to breakdown.
Like many other truth seekers, and want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks, you'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to stevekane.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to stevekane.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.